The work I'm presenting to you today is in a report form, and I'm not sure if any of you dared to even look at it. It was quite a heavy-duty piece of number crunching and things like that. So I'm here to maybe help work through some of that, but I really can't cover all of it in 20 minutes. I've even brought my colleague Ron Saunders here, who's a co-author on this piece, along with a number of us at the Institute have worked on this piece. So, and we're all available to help continue the dialogue. And I'm relying on you guys actually to help interpret some of this stuff too. So I'm going to maybe try to throw it back to you to give us some sense of, and Karen, maybe you'll have a good sense of it too, and you give us some sense of what's behind data. Remember we talked a lot yesterday about, well, what is really behind the data? It's hard for me to know unless we talk to people like you, because we're using data that's from Statistics Canada. We don't even see the data. This data set that I'm using for this study, I don't ever see it directly myself. I give them code, they give me back results kind of thing. I used to work with it directly myself when I lived up in Ottawa and did some work on this database, but nowadays we do it remote access, they call it. And this is just one piece that looking at poverty over time, across different legislations that have existed here in Ontario, as well as there's British Columbia. We have some data on British Columbia as well, and some claimants from their program. And then we'll have a couple other presentations that are looking at the same issue with different data sources, right? And there's some common ground, in fact, quite a bit actually, Perry, and there's some differences, right? So we'll have to try to understand how to digest some of those differences. So this study, we tried to investigate the prevalence of poverty, and we'll give a definition to that later on, of permanently impaired workers over time and across different workers' compensation programs. As you know, if any of you know the history in Ontario, we've had probably the last 25 years 3 or 4 different major legislations that have changed the way benefits are determined and who qualifies and who doesn't, that kind of thing. The most recently, in 1998, the loss of earnings program that was introduced, and I have a little bit of data from that program here as well. So we really want to look at what the prevalence of poverty is for injured workers with permanent impairments from these different programs. And we do an interesting thing, and to varying levels of success, I guess, and we can talk about what it really means. We tried to match these injured workers with people who looked like them, in terms of the earnings that they had, their age, their gender, who weren't injured workers, to see, well, where does their life take them versus the injured workers, right? To do a comparison. So maybe thinking of it as a sort of a counterfactual scenario, a hypothetical thing. Like, if these people weren't injured, what would have happened to their lives, in terms of earnings and, in the labor market and things like that. So we try to do that, but we also want to look at the absolute levels, like really what is their actual experiences. That's obviously the most important thing, right? And we want to think about, has it changed over time, the prevalence of poverty, right? Across these different programs, across different cohorts and generations, because some of the programs we're looking at are from the 1980s, a completely different generation, different labor markets compared to more recent cohorts, right? But I'm going to focus really on the loss of earnings program in this presentation because of time. And it's the most recent one that still exists today, right? So obviously the loss of earnings program is the one that's most relevant, and it's called Bill 99. Bill 99 that was introduced in 1998 under the Harris government, and made a lot of other changes as well to not just benefits adequacy, but also making it an insurance board rather than a compensation board. Okay, so in the report, it's available online electronically. If people come to us, or we can point you where they are, or get you copies of it. And we are looking at 4 different programs in that report, so there's a lot to digest. We have the 1998 program, Bill 99, the LOE program is the most recent one, but we also look at do people remember the FEL-NEL, the Future Economic Loss program that was in existence for a period of 8 years in the 1990s. We have a group of injured workers from that program, and then we even have a group of injured workers from the program that existed before 1990, and it was called PD, Permanent Disability Program. Completely different system back then, no deeming or anything like that in that program. And then we have some injured workers from British Columbia. We just happen to have that data also available to us, who were who injured in the 1990s, and they had a very different program. It was described as a bifurcated, which just means there's two ways the benefits could be determined. So I won't focus very much on that one, but we just started comparing these different programs, how do injured workers fare under the different benefits regimes. The principal data source that we're using, it's called the LAD. It's a Longitudinal Administrative Data Bank. So I'm going to say LAD because that's just too much to say the full name, right? It's taken from the Canadian tax files. So what they do is they take 1 in 5 people, or 20%, and they put them in this database. So 1 in 5 of us here would be in that database. And they keep pulling that person's tax files whenever they file for their whole life, so that you can follow that person. If you've been chosen, if you're the lucky person, 1 in 5 that are in there, they'll keep pulling your data each year when you file your taxes and put it in this, so that you can follow that person over time till they die. So also what they do is they also put in their census families as well. And census family, it's just a construct of a family. There's different notions. You can think of a household, everybody lives in the same house, or extended families. But they use a census family, which is your mother, father, children, right? So your grandparents, if they live with you, wouldn't be counted in that family. It would just be your spouse and your children. If you're a child, then your parents, right? That kind of thing. And only if you live in the same household. So it's called census family. So that you have data not just on the taxes files of that individual, that's a principal observation, but also on their family unit, so that you can look at census family in earnings. Oh, and it's also, they say it's very representative, because most people who are in working age, maybe 20 to 65, are file even when they're not working, because you get tax credits. So students will get tax credits, and so they get money back even if they haven't paid much taxes. It's an equalization program, I guess, that they have for low-income earners. So it's really representative. Like 98% of working age population are in that database. Okay, so the data sources that we use other than the Statistics Canada LAD database is we took claimants or injured workers from Ontario and British Columbia, as I mentioned, from those different programs, and we took the information on their benefits over a period of time up to 10 years in some cases, and took that information and linked that up with that database called the LAD, because that database, even though it has income information, it doesn't do a good job of covering workers' compensation benefits because they're not taxable. So even if you may file your taxes, you didn't need to identify how much you got from non-taxable sources. And so that information is not always there. It's also not broken up into the same kind of pieces of information. You can't really look at, non-economic loss separately from future economic loss and yearly amounts in the same ways that you can get from the administrative files from the Workers' Compensation Board. So we took the actual information on identifying the person who has a permanent impairment, the degree of permanent impairment, and their benefits from the administrative files, and linked that up with the LAD database at Statistics Canada. What we don't have included, actually, I want to point out, is workers whose claims are denied. So that's not going to be in there. This is just claims that are accepted, injured workers' claims that are accepted, and if they didn't file. So that's a big issue nowadays, obviously, is people aren't filing, they don't qualify for whatever reason, they're discouraged from filing, they're pushed off into other programs. We had John Stapleton speak about the welfarization of workers' compensation and work disability, more broadly speaking. That's not going to get captured here, right? Because those are people just are outside of this system, right? So we're only going to see people who are in the system. Okay. I just thought I'd mention privacy issues. I didn't actually see people's social insurance numbers, even though that's the way it gets linked up. All of it went through the Workers' Compensation Boards, Ontario and in British Columbia, sending it to Statistics Canada's information to do the linkage. So we were really conscious of the confidentiality issue. So I never actually see any micro data on people's tax files here. I mentioned a bit about the kinds of data that's in the LAD. It's tax files, so anybody who's filed their own taxes probably has a sense of the kinds of things you have to report, your labor market earnings, earnings from other sources as well, Canada Pension Plan, earnings and benefits when you retire or disabled and receive them, unemployment benefits, investment, all of that stuff that's on your tax files, T1 tax forms, will be reported there as separate revenue flows. Non-taxable income like workers' compensation, social assistance, and child benefits are also on there if they're reported, but I'm told that it covers only about 70% of those benefits because they're not taxable. And then it also has how much taxes you have to pay as well. So whatever provincial and federal taxes you owe will be identified on there as well. So a lot of stuff. We don't use it all actually, but there's a lot there. Okay, so what we did was we took those cohorts from those 4 programs. The LOE program from 1998. We had 5 years from the FEL-NEL program. 4 years from the PD program, and another 5 years from the BC program. Took them and linked them with the LAD using social insurance numbers, so that we could identify not just the injured worker and their benefits, but also all the stuff that's in the LAD database, and follow them over time as well. And it was pretty accurate as far as I can say in terms of successfully identifying the people we thought we would. I said it's a 20% sampling of the people, Canadian population or tax filers, and you'd expect to see 1 in 5. Well, we did get 18 to 19%, so just 1 or 2 percentage points below what the ideal number would be in that linkage process. You do stop me and ask questions if some of this stuff isn't articulated well. I'm a numbers person, as you can see, so maybe I need more flowery language to kind of give examples of some of the things, and we'll try to do that when we get into the actual results. Okay, so this slide, I just wanted to give you a sense of the distribution by different key demographic characteristics of this cohort of people from the different programs that we linked up. So as you can imagine, most of them were men. Injuries happen in high-risk sectors where maybe the predominant kind of person working there is a male. Older as well, so 35 to 49 was the largest age bracket, and you can see over the cohorts in Ontario in particular how a larger fraction are in that age bracket with more recent groups, right? So in the LOE program, more than half of the people were in that age bracket. So it's just the aging demographics of the population, I'm guessing, right? Most of them were in the 10 to 20% impairment level. This is the impairment rating that the program gives to it. So if we're using American Medical Association guides currently, I think in the PD program they had their own book or schedule of how they identified levels of permanent impairment, so they might not be completely comparable. And British Columbia also has its own schedule. That there's a lot of similarities, but they don't follow the exact same code book as the American Medical Association guides being used in Ontario currently. And then the largest group in terms of pre-injury earnings was in the $20,000 to $40,000. 35% of the loss of earnings program, the LOE program, were injured workers were in that category of earnings prior to their injury, or in the year of injury. Okay, so and I just want to point out to you that the LOE program, we only had 1 year in this data linkage. We did this linkage quite some time ago, and we didn't have access to a lot of the LOE program at that time because we wanted to have a number of years following the year of injury to see how these people, their lives turned out in terms of earnings after their work injury. And so we did the linkage, I think it was in 2006 or 2007, and so we only had the 1 year of the program. So it may not be representative. It's also small, like there's only, in the actual linked group, there's only 1,200 people, so it's not a big group, right? But the other ones are much larger because we have more years of injured workers being linked up in those programs, sort of thing. So just keep that in mind. So it's the smallest group and maybe not representative because that's the first year of the program. And it's also not representative about what's happening today, because that's quite an old cohort for us today.
Hi, Emile. Could you just clarify when you're talking about the $20,000 to $40,000 income
Yes.
Prior to injury? You also said in the year of injury. So does that account for what if someone gets injured in March, for example?
Yes.
No?
Okay. Good. That's a good question. Okay. So no, this was what their earnings. They're kind of stylized in terms of we took the. Well, I'll describe it a little bit later, but we matched the claimants with the injured worker claimants with a group of people who weren't injured, and we took the earnings in that year for the matched ones, which they're not injured, so it would be a full year of earnings. So it's not like somebody gets injured in June and only makes half as much. This is what their stylized earnings would be in if they hadn't gotten injured in the injury year. And we can come back to it, and I'll describe how that's done. Okay, but we could see their actual earnings as well through the tax files, and it does obviously change dramatically because their injuries happen and they're not working. Okay, so what we did for the matching, and you know, economists like to kind of have this notion of, well, what would have happened, right? And that's really hypothetical. We don't know for sure, you know, what would happen in these people's lives. So, you know, what can we do? What can we do to kind of get some semblance of it? So we match them up with people, like I said, that were similar to them in a number of characteristics prior to that injury event. You know, to see, well, you know, on average, you know, people like them. You know, this is what they look like after that year that the injury happens, and this group that we're comparing them to didn't get injured. So we match them up to what we call controls. You know, up to 10 controls. Each injured worker was matched up to 10 controls. And what we did was we matched them based on their earnings in each of the 4 years prior to the injury year. This, because we're doing poverty, and poverty is also often based on family earnings, so we also matched the family earnings in the 4 years prior. Now that's adjusting for family size too. And I'll get into that, a bit of that too. That we, you know, obviously if a family's bigger, more people, there's more earnings possibly, right? So we adjust for family size. Whether or not there's children, like just yes or no, whether there's someone under 18 in that family unit in the previous years, we match them by sex. So women with women, men with men, age as well. So they have to be the same age. They have to be the same marital status. They have to live in Ontario and in the same region, just based on the first letter of the postal code. So the 5 postal code regions. We also looked at the filing patterns prior to the injury year. Just, you know, some people might have low earnings and not file regularly, and we thought, well, those people may be different kinds of people, so we matched them with controls as best we could, but that had intermittent filing. And then something we call a propensity score, which I won't get into, but it's a statistical approach where you say, what's the likelihood of this person getting a work injury and being a workers' compensation claimant? Like, it's a statistical modeling approach that's called propensity score matching. That we just say, well, are the controls like them in that way, using this statistical approach? So we want to match them to look like these people would also likely have a work injury, all else being equal. Okay, so reason for matching is that, you know, we can see what that happens to the injured workers after their work injury, and that's critically important as well. But we want to see, well, where would they have been maybe if that didn't happen to them? And that's what the control service, sort of like this counterfactual scenario. But we're also obviously going to focus on the absolute levels of poverty. Low income measure is a common metric used for measuring poverty. Low income measure, it looks at the family income in a particular year, so it's done on a yearly basis, adjusted for the family size, and then they do this for the whole population, and then they look at what's in the middle, the median of that population in terms of family income adjusted for family size, and they say you're poor or you're in low income if you have half of that value. And I'll give you some actual numbers too. But that low income measure is a common measure of poverty if you're below this 50% of the median family income. There's the LICO too, and I think Perry will be talking about LICOs as well. first person's given in that adjustment, you're saying the first person is valued at 1, the second person, maybe because 2 people living together, the second person doesn't cost twice as much for the family cost of living, so they give it a weight of 4, and children are given a weight of, 0.4, and children given a weight of 0.3. You can do this before or after tax, so LIM values, low income measures, are given in before tax or after tax. The work I've done here is all after tax because obviously that's the money you have to spend, right? It's after tax, right? Who cares before tax? Because that's not all yours, it's the government's. As I said, we're using the census family definition for here, so we're looking at LIMs for census families. So here's some examples of how these values vary based on how many people there are in the family unit. So this is looking in 2007 after-tax LIM values. So if there's no children, just a single person living on their own, the low-income measure is $16,000. If there's 2 people, 2 adults in that unit, it's $22,000. Add a kid to those 2 adults, and it's $27,000. So they just give you a sense of how those values work. Okay, and then this is something that I got from Perry, some poverty contract that's just taking a little bit further. Rather than just saying yes, no, above or below this LIM value, we're thinking about how far are you from this value. Are you really far from it in terms of the low end or the high end? So we're looking at deep poverty, saying you have less than half of the LIM value. So it takes you really low in terms of your earnings and your family situation. Just poverty where you're in mid-range to right up to the LIM value, and you might also just be above the LIM value, but you're still pretty close to it. So we call it near poverty. And the people who are over 150% we talk about them being well above poverty. So you're kind of giving some granularity to people's experiences rather than just saying yes, no, you're above or below the LIM. Okay, and then I'm going to show some graphs where we're going to first consider after-tax labor market earnings only for each of the injured workers and their match controls compared to the LIM, like how many people are in those different deep poverty, near poverty categories. And I start off with after-tax labor market earnings. We want to say, well, that's most people's principal source of earnings is their labor market earnings. It's not their only source of earnings, but it's a good starting point to think, can they self-sustain themselves through their labor market activity to earn a livelihood that would keep them above poverty levels, right? But then we add on their workers' compensation benefits as another level of analysis, because obviously the injured workers after their work injury may not be working, but then they get some wage replacement benefits from the workers' compensation board. What does that happens to them then? Are they doing a little bit better? Are they doing much better? And then the final layer is really looking at the whole family unit and adjusting for family size, and takes into consideration earnings from all the sources that are reported on the tax files after tax and adjusted for family size. I only have 5 minutes. So let's find out. I can talk to you guys about this afterwards too, because there's a lot to digest. So here's the first graph. We're looking at the LOE program. I call it a hypothetical scenario because all we're looking at is their labor market earnings, nothing else, no workers' compensation benefits in this picture here that we're seeing. And we're looking at the people who are in deep poverty. What fraction of our sample is in deep poverty just with their labor market earnings? And as you can see, there's 2 lines. There's a dotted line and there's a solid line. The solid line is the injured worker cohort, and the dotted line is their match controls. Right? And the beginning part, before the work injury year, that's listed there. I've lined everybody, even though they may be injured in different years. Or in this case, they're all 1998 actually, sorry. It matches, because that's by design. We match them up to do that. So there's very low levels of deep poverty. It's in around 2.5% here, I guess. It's hard, I don't have all the details. It's well below 5%. And then the injury year happens, and the injured worker cohort from the LOE program, substantially high levels of deep poverty, up 20, 25%. and it just grows modestly for their matched controls, right? Now this is only their labor market earnings, and it's over time. We follow them for 9 years following their work injury year. And so this is an older cohort, remember, so some of these people are retiring, right? So maybe this is growing because all I'm looking at is their labor market earnings, and some of these people maybe are getting the controls are retiring at 55, 60 and getting their pensions at that point. But the injured workers obviously aren't, right? So they're doing very badly there. Okay. The poverty one, this is between 50 to 100% of the limb. Is a little bit better, but we see that dispersion after the injury year, it goes up to 15% for the injured worker cohort, and it's only about just below 10% for their matched controls. And then the near poverty, a little bit more comparability here. So there's a blip around the injury years, 1 or 2 years afterwards, but not too different. It's all in around 12, 11, 10%, that range for both groups. Now that's just their labor market earnings. This is sorry, it's a hugely messy graph. Maybe I'll skip over this quickly. I'm just doing the differencing between those two groups. So this is an absolute difference. Just looking at their after-tax labor market earnings. So I won't go through this because this is going to be too complicated. I've just compiled all those deep poverty, and near poverty together into one graph, and the one that's well above poverty as well. And just looking at the absolute differences.
Emile, can you just remind me, I'm sorry I probably missed it, but the injured workers who are in this,
yes.
Are they specifically injured workers who have been identified with permanent impairment or just any?
Yes, sorry, yes.
Yeah.
And you did miss, I forgot to say that,
okay.
that we're only looking at people who have permanent impairment claims. Yes.
Thanks.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that we aren't looking at temporary, Now some of these, surprisingly, this is a really interesting tidbit, have no lost time permanent impairment claims.
Yeah.
And technically, they probably have lost time, but they are labeled as being no lost time permanent impairment claims.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. And I'm told it may be hearing loss. I'm not sure what other kinds of things, but it's I found it surprising because I think as much as 19% have no lost time.
So Emile, just on the
yes.
What is the unemployment rate of? Were you able to gauge what unemployment rate there is among permanently disabled injured workers?
Well, we just saw the people who are in deep poverty being up at 25%. With just their labor market earnings. So clearly they're not making a lot of money if they've been labeled as being in deep poverty with just their labor market earnings. You can't really gauge unemployment rates with tax files in the same way as that's reported with, say, labor force survey data, because it's not just saying yes, no, are you looking for work? It's saying how much money did you earn over the last year? Is it in the labor market? Is it a meaningful amount? And obviously for deep poverty, it's not a meaningful amount. So now I'm going to add the workers' compensation benefits, and obviously things are going to improve in some cases quite notably, but we'll still find people in deep poverty and people in poverty and near poverty. So now we've added here just their workers' compensation benefits that they've received in each year. So these are, by the way, just cross sections of the sample. I'm not looking over time within a person. I'm just saying. Each year we have our group of injured workers. How are they doing 1 year after their injury, 2 years, 3 years? What category do they fall into, near poverty, deep poverty? So now we're adding their labor market earnings plus their benefits and looking also at the controls. The controls line is not going to change, right? Because that we already looked at it, just the labor market earnings. I only have 6 years here because we only had 6 years of workers' compensation data linked up at that time for this cohort. So the last few graphs we were looking at labor market earnings over 10 years. We could do that because that's just the tax files, and the tax files I can follow them right till the end of the tax files, whenever the last ones were registered, right? But here I'm focusing on workers' compensation benefits plus their labor market earnings, and I only had workers' comp for 6 years linked up, right? So we're seeing this is like the LOE program again, and it's looking at deep poverty. So for the claimants, it's the solid line, it's around 2%, goes up, and it increases as the years following injury, goes up to about 7-8%, 6 years afterwards. So clearly there's something happening there where they're having higher levels of poverty as they progress. And my sense is there's maybe some benefits at the front end, but at the tail end, when they get older, there's very little benefits given to them, kind of thing. So we'll see that consistently across, even at the family income, that there's a growth in the proportion in each of the poverty categories as time progresses. But we also see it a little bit with the controls too. Now, remember, I matched these people up with people who looked the same, right? So if the injured worker was in precarious employment, their matching controls are as well, right? So the situation, and ultimately, it's a hypothetical thing, right? What we care about is what really happens to these people and their lived experiences, right? So the controls are just one other way of looking at, well, what are other people doing who are similar, kind of thing. But they started off being similar too. So they're maybe both in precarious employment. As aging goes on, the people in precarious employment might lose their jobs as well, even if they're not injured, kind of thing. So the world is an ugly place sometimes, right? For other people as well. This is the poverty level. This is between 50 to 100% of them. We see here too, it's a little bit better for the injured workers than what we saw before because we're adding on the workers' compensation benefits, but it's still between 4% and it goes up to 8%. So if we're adding up what we saw in deep poverty plus this one, we're bringing it up to about 15% maybe, right? And then if we look at near poverty, there's more than in the controls for the injured workers. In near poverty, there's a higher proportion, and it's also growing over time. It's about 12%, even after we add on the workers' compensation benefit. So we add up those three categories, and it's like 25% of people in deep poverty, and near poverty across the claimant group. So probably comparable to your numbers, I'm guessing. Perry's, yeah. Okay. And then I just do the differencing, which gets really messy in this graph, so I'm putting it all together into one graph. And I'm not going to go into the next section, but we then go into looking at family incomes, and then we go looking at adjusting for family size, and we look across the LOE program and all the other programs as well, just to see whether we see any differences across programs. And the main thing if I can summarize, 30 seconds?
30 seconds.
Okay, so the growth in poverty levels we see across all the programs. The way we see it as time passes, from the time of injury, more people in poverty in the various poverty categories across the programs, and very similar patterns across the programs. So we don't see dramatic differences, from the older programs to the more recent programs, or the BC program to the BC program does a little bit better, but generally the situation is pretty similar, where about 25% are in one of those deep, near, or poverty levels, regardless of which program you look at. The only differences we're seeing in the LOE program, and it's only 1 year cohort, is a larger fraction are in the near poverty category than in the previous programs. So that group is growing, kind of thing. So they're not in the poverty category, but they're near poverty. That's growing more than in the other programs. Does that help? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.